Welcome to the Drift and Ramble podcast. I'm Steve Blizin. Each episode will explore true stories and American legends. From the pages of history and a few stories handed down over the years, we'll look at the people, places, and events that helped shape a nation. Stories of survival, notable frontier men and women, explorers who struck it rich, and the outlaws that stole it from them. There'll be studies of saloon girls, swindlers, banditry, and bad men, profiles of lawmen and American Indians, and the good and evil that existed between them. We'll amble through the past. We'll delve into the folklore of the times and maybe even uncover a ghost story or two. So, saddle up or settle in for the Drift and Ramble podcast. This is episode 25. The man we're about to meet is an Apache. At the time that he tells us his story, he is in his late 70s, and he is a prisoner of the United States military. He is now, as he was then, one of the most famous Native Americans in history. Though he is known to his people as Koya-A, or one who yawns, he is more commonly known as Geronimo.
In the beginning, the world was covered with darkness. There was no sun, no day. The perpetual night had no moon or stars. There were, however, all manner of beasts and birds. Among the beasts were many hideous, nameless monsters, as well as dragons, lions, tigers, wolves, foxes, beavers, rabbits, squirrels, rats, mice, and all manner of creeping things such as lizards and serpents. Mankind could not prosper under such conditions, for the beasts and serpents destroyed all human offsprings. All creatures had the power of speech and were gifted with reason. There were two tribes of creatures, the birds, or the feathered tribe, and the beasts. The former were organized under their chief, the eagle. These tribes often held councils, and the birds wanted light admitted. This the beasts repeatedly refused to do. Finally, the birds made war against the beasts. The beasts were armed with clubs, but the eagle had taught his tribe to use bows and arrows. The serpents were so wise that they could not all be killed. One took refuge in a perpendicular cliff of a mountain in Arizona, and its eye changed into a brilliant stone that may be seen in that rock to this day. The bears, when killed, would each be changed into several other bears, so that the more bears the feathered tribe killed, the more there were. The dragon could not be killed either, for he was covered with 4 coats of horny scales, and the arrows would not penetrate these. One of the most hideous, vile monsters was proofed against arrows, so the eagle flew high up in the air with a round white stone and let it fall on this monster's head, killing him instantly. This was such a good service that the stone was called sacred. A symbol of this stone is used in the tribal game of Ka. They fought for many days, but at last the birds won the victory. After this war was over, although some evil beasts remained, the birds were able to control the councils, and light was admitted. Then mankind could live and prosper. The eagle was chief in this good fight. Therefore, his feathers were worn by man as emblems of wisdom, justice, and power. Among the few human beings that were yet alive was a woman who had been blessed with many children, but these had always been destroyed by the beast. If by any means she succeeded in eluding the others, the dragon, who was very wise and very evil, would come himself and eat her babies. After many years, a son of the rainstorm was born to her, and she dug for him a deep cave. The entrance to this cave she closed, and over the spot built a campfire. This concealed the babe's hiding place and kept him warm. Every day she would remove the fire and descend into the cave where the child's bed was to nurse him. Then she would return and rebuild the campfire. Frequently, the dragon would come and question her, but she would say, "I have no more children. You have eaten all of them." When the child was larger, he would not always stay in the cave, for he sometimes wanted to run and play. Once, the dragon saw his tracks. This perplexed and enraged the old dragon, for he could not find the hiding place of the boy. But he said that he would destroy the mother if she did not reveal the child's hiding place. The poor mother was very much troubled. She could not give up her child, but she knew the power and cunning of the dragon. Therefore, she lived in constant fear. Soon after this, the boy said that he wished to go hunting. The mother would not give her consent. She told him of the dragon, the wolves, and the serpents, but he said, "Tomorrow I go." At the boy's request, his uncle, who was the only man then living, made a little bow and some arrows for him, and the two went hunting the next day. They trailed the deer far up the mountain, and finally the boy killed the buck. His uncle showed him how to dress the deer and broil the meat. They broiled 2 hindquarters, one for the child and one for his uncle. When the meat was done, they placed it on some bushes to cool. Just then, the huge form of the dragon appeared. The child was not afraid, but his uncle was so dumb with fright that he did not speak or move. The dragon took the boy's parcel of meat and went aside with it. He placed the meat on another bush and seated himself beside it. Then he said, "This is the child I have been seeking. Boy, you are nice and fat, so when I have eaten this venison, I shall eat you." The boy said, "No, you shall not eat me, and you shall not eat that meat." So he walked over to where the dragon sat and took the meat back to his own seat. The dragon said, "I like your courage, but you are foolish. What do you think you could do?" "Well," said the boy, "I can do enough to protect myself, as you may find out." Then the dragon took the meat again, and then the boy retook it. 4 times in all the dragon took the meat. And after the 4th time the boy replaced the meat, he said, "Dragon, will you fight me?" The dragon said, "Yes, in whatever way you like." The boy said, "I will stand 100 paces distant from you, and you may have 4 shots at me with your bow and arrows, provided that you will then exchange places with me and give me 4 shots." "Good," said the dragon. "Stand up." Then the dragon took his bow, which was made of large pine tree. He took 4 arrows from his quiver. They were made of young pine tree saplings, and each arrow was 20 feet in length. He took deliberate aim, but just as the arrow left the bow, the boy made a peculiar sound and leaped into the air. Immediately the arrow was shattered into 1,000 splinters, and the boy was seen standing on top of a bright rainbow over the spot where the dragon's aim had been directed. Soon the rainbow was gone, and the boy was standing on the ground again. 4 times this was repeated. Then the boy said, "Dragon, stand here. It is my time to shoot." The dragon said, "All right, your little arrows cannot pierce my first coat of horn, and I have 3 other coats. Shoot away." The boy shot an arrow, striking the dragon just above the heart, and 1 coat of the great horny scales fell to the ground. The next shot, another coat, and then another, and the dragon's heart was exposed. Then the dragon trembled, but he could not move. Before the 4th arrow was shot, the boy said, "Uncle, you are dumb with fear. You have not moved. Come here, or the dragon will fall on you." His uncle ran toward him. Then he sped the fourth arrow with true aim, and it pierced the dragon's heart. With a tremendous roar, the dragon rolled down the mountainside, down 4 precipices into a canyon below. Immediately storm clouds swept the mountains, lightning flashed, thunder rolled, and the rain poured. When the rainstorm had passed, far down in the canyon below they could see fragments of the huge body of the dragon lying among the rocks, and the bones of this dragon may still be found there. This boy's name was Apache. Usen taught him how to prepare herbs for medicine, how to hunt, and how to fight. He was the first chief of the Indians and wore the eagle's feathers as a sign of justice, wisdom, and power. To him and to his people, as they were created, Usen gave homes in the land of the West.
Usen is the Apache word for God. It is used here because it implies the attributes of deity that are held in the Apache's primitive religion. Apache means enemy. 4 is considered to be a magic number among the Bedunkohe Apaches. The dragon has 4 coats of scales. He takes little Apache's meat 4 times. They, the dragon and Apache, exchange 4 shots each. The dragon rolls down 4 precipices. In the tribal game of Ka, there are 4 moccasins used and only 4 plays that can be made. Geronimo is the 4th of a family of 4 boys and 4 girls. He has had 4 wives that were full-blood Bedunkohe Apaches and 4 that were mixed-breed Apache. 4 of his children have been killed by Mexicans and 4 have been held in bondage by the U.S. government. He firmly believes in destiny and in the magic of the number 4.
That's Stephen Melville Barnett. He's the superintendent of schools in Lawton, Oklahoma. And it's because of him that Geronimo's story gets told. Stephen Barnett encourages Geronimo to tell his story, in his way, as a way to preserve the Native American experience. And it's thanks to Mr. Barnett's persistence that Geronimo was even allowed to tell his story. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Geronimo tells us about his childhood.
As a babe, I rolled on the dirt floor of my father's teepee, hung in my sajak at my mother's back, or suspended from the bough of a tree. I was warmed by the sun, rocked by the winds, and sheltered by the trees as other Indian babes. When a child, my mother taught me the legends of our people, taught me of the sun and the sky, the moon and stars, the clouds and storms. My father had often told me of the brave deeds of our warriors, of the pleasures of the chase, and the glories of the warpath. With my brothers and sisters, I played about my father's home. Sometimes we played at hide and seek among the rocks and pines. Sometimes we loitered in the shade of the cottonwood trees or sought the shaddock, a kind of wild cherry, while our parents worked in the field. Sometimes we played that we were warriors. We would practice stealing upon some object that represented an enemy, and our childish imitation often performed the feats of war. Sometimes we would hide away from our mother to see if she could find us, and often when thus concealed, go to sleep and perhaps remain hidden for many hours.
Geronimo grows to be a competent warrior. He earns respect by removing arrows, bullets, and treating wounded warriors. For this, some say he is a medicine man, but others will later say he possesses supernatural powers. He seems to know of distant events as they happen, and he has accurate predictions about the future. In 1848, after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, Mexico ceded lands of what would become the American Southwest, and white settlers began to impede the Apache way of life. But it was not the whites with which Geronimo held his grudge against. On March 5, 1851, when Geronimo is still in his 20s, a force of Mexican militia from Sonora perform a surprise attack on an Apache camp outside of Janos, Chihuahua. There are no Apache survivors. Geronimo's entire family are killed in the attack. Colonel Jose Maria Carrasco claims his men followed the Apaches to the camp after the Apache had conducted a raid in Sonora, taking livestock and other supplies and badly defeating the Mexican militia. Geronimo returns to his camp to find his mother, wife, and 3 young children among the dead. He vows revenge and retaliates, beginning a long and vicious cycle of raids on Mexican encampments. He kills them indiscriminately and violently. Geronimo's hatred for Mexicans is demonstrably greater than any contempt he holds for Americans. During one of these raids, the Mexicans yell something at the young warrior. Unsure of what exactly is being said, it is believed this is how the young warrior, once known as Koyae, the one who yawns, becomes forever known as Geronimo.
I have killed many Mexicans. I do not know how many, for frequently I did not count them. Some of them were not worth counting. It has been a long time since then, but still I have no love for the Mexicans. With me, they were always treacherous and malicious.
Though white settlers do become targets for occasional Apache raids, Geronimo fixates on the Mexicans for his grudge. But as the United States government extends its westward reach, it forces the Apache to commingle with other tribes on reservation lands that are constantly shifting and shrinking. By 1876, most of Geronimo's people have been shipped to the dry, hot, often inhospitable reservation in San Carlos. By now, Geronimo has achieved celebrity status. He is a living legend. Though he is not a chief, he holds a certain prominence among his people. As a warrior, his reputation is well known, but he is also considered to be a medicine man, able to slow time, heal the sick, and summon rainstorms. Though many people claim the warrior can predict the future, at least one recorded incident proves the theory true. Geronimo claims to have had a premonition that his base camp will be attacked by U.S. military troops. A few days later, when his men arrive at the camp, they find that Geronimo's prophecy did come true. A witness later reports,
I cannot explain it to this day, but I was there and I saw it.
Reservation life may have shielded the Apache from the violence of war, but there are worse ways to die than in battle. Conditions on the reservations are squalid. Disease runs rampant, and with their freedom and nomadic existence forever changed, many cannot adjust to life under guard. Corrupt Indian agents only make things worse. They handle food supplies poorly, often running out of rations due to mismanagement and bribes. Geronimo is frustrated by the treatment of his people, and he and his followers defiantly embarrass the U.S. government by escaping from what Geronimo considers to be unjust imprisonment. He continues to elude Army forces, and the Apache scouts sent to track him, and despite concerted efforts to stop him, Geronimo continues to grab headlines for his escapades. Though whites are sometimes targeted, it is the Mexican people that most often suffer Geronimo's wrath. Still, the very name of Geronimo strikes fear in the hearts of American settlers. Territorial newspapers attribute almost every crime in the area to his name. Each time government agents round up Geronimo and his crew, the man makes a sport of escaping. Finally, on May 17, 1885, Geronimo and 135 Apache men, women, and children leave their reservation for the final time. He remains determined as ever to elude his pursuers. He pushes his group to cover distances of up to 70 miles per day just to avoid the U.S. cavalry and Apache scouts on their trail. The U.S. government responds, deploying 5,000 soldiers after Geronimo, nearly a quarter of the entire standing army, as well as 3,000 Mexican soldiers. Operating under the command of General George Crook, the army successfully tracked Geronimo and his bands into their mountain strongholds. Many are killed or captured. Band leaders are demoralized, seeing their own tribesmen at work tracking them down. The rigors of constant pursuit trigger steady attrition among Geronimo's holdouts. Geronimo himself, however, remains steadfast. Washington bureaucrats increase the pressure on General Crook to capture this renegade Indian and his band of troublemakers. Crook launches a second expedition into Mexico, and on January 9, 1886, Geronimo and his band are located. Captain Crawford's Indian scouts attack the following morning. They capture the outlaw Apache's horses and seize their camp equipment. For the Apache warrior and his 39 remaining loyalists, it looks like the endless pursuit is over. Geronimo agrees to negotiate for surrender. The next day, he sends one of the women from his camp to speak with Captain Crawford. They agree to a council, but before the negotiations take place, Mexican troops arrive and mistake the Apache scouts working for the U.S. Army as enemy Apache. In the resulting attack between the Mexican and U.S. forces, Captain Crawford is killed. Only minutes before he was shot, he had been waving the white flag to the Mexican soldiers. After intense fighting, the Mexicans raised the white flag themselves. During the ceasefire, Lieutenant Mouse discovers the Mexicans were attempting to collect a lofty $200 bounty for each scalp of Apache warrior offered by the Mexican government. Lieutenant Mouse then finally meets with Geronimo, who agrees to meet with General Crook. Later, Lieutenant Mouse would file a report on the battle with the Mexican Army that states the Mexicans were fully aware they were firing upon U.S. military forces. A Mexican inquiry results in similar findings. Though the U.S. and Mexico nearly go to war over the incident, the U.S. decides to let the matter rest, and Lieutenant Mouse receives the Medal of Honor for his actions. During the next 3 days of negotiations in March of 1886, photographer C.S. Fly takes some of his most famous photographs. The 15 exposures include the only known photographs taken of an American Indian while still at war with the United States, the only known photos of Geronimo's surrender, and one image that is specifically made at Geronimo's request. It includes Geronimo standing proudly with 2 of his sons. Although Fly's photos are remarkable, this would not be Fly's only history-making experience. Fly was also an eyewitness to the shootout at the OK Corral. Among the 39 Indians was a white boy named Jimmy McKinn, who had been abducted from his ranch in New Mexico in September of the previous year. 6 months later, when McKinn was reunited with his parents, the child protested vehemently and wanted to remain with the Indians.
General Crook said to me, "Why did you leave the reservation?" I said, "You told me that I might live in the reservation the same as white people live. One year I raised a crop of corn and gathered and stored it, and the next year I put in a crop of oats, and when the crop was almost ready for harvest, you told your soldiers to put me in prison, and if I resisted, to kill me. If I had been let alone, I would now have been in good circumstances. But instead of that, you and the Mexicans are hunting me with soldiers."
Geronimo had been camped on the Mexican side of the border. Though he had agreed to Crook's surrender terms, that night a soldier sold the Indians whiskey and told them they would all be murdered as soon as they crossed the border. Geronimo and his followers slipped away that night. Crook was blamed for failing to bring Geronimo in. After a heated exchange of angry telegrams with General Philip Sheridan, in which Crook attempted to defend his men's actions, he finally sent a telegram asking Sheridan to relieve him of command. Sheridan was all too willing to do it. Sheridan replaced Crook with General Nelson A. Miles. Miles, in turn, selected Captain Henry Lawton to pursue, subdue, and return Geronimo to the U.S., dead or alive. Geronimo surrenders on September 4, 1886. He gives himself up to General Nelson Miles at Skeleton Canyon, Arizona. He is the last Indian leader to formally surrender to the United States military. Lawton's official report, dated September 9, 1886, sums up the actions of his unit and gives credit to a number of his troops for their efforts. Geronimo gave Gatewood credit for his decision to surrender, as Gatewood was well known to Geronimo, spoke some Apache, and was familiar with and honored their traditions and values. He acknowledged Lawton's tenacity for wearing the Apaches down with constant pursuit. Following his surrender, Geronimo, his followers, and even the Apache scouts who helped track them down are condemned to manual labor at an internment camp in Florida. Geronimo will spend the next 23 years of his life as a prisoner of war and a scout for the U.S. Army. During this time, his celebrity only increases. He sells autographs, walking sticks, bows, even the buttons off his shirt to American tourists. He and his people are moved to camps in Alabama and finally Fort Sill, Oklahoma. During this time, he is granted permission to be photographed with an automobile, to participate in World's Fairs and Wild West shows, where he is billed as the Apache Terror and the Tiger of the human race.
When I was first asked to attend the St. Louis World's Fair, I did not wish to go. Later, when I was told that I would receive good attention and protection, and that the President of the United States said that it would be all right, I consented. Every Sunday, the president of the fair sent for me to go to a Wild West show. I took part in the roping contest before the audience. There were many other Indian tribes there, and strange people of whom I have never heard. I am glad I went to the fair. I saw many interesting things and learned much of the white people. They are very kind and peaceful people. During all the time I was at the fair, no one tried to harm me in any way. Had this been among the Mexicans, I am sure I should have been compelled to defend myself often.
Geronimo, still a prisoner of war, is granted permission to participate in Theodore Roosevelt's presidential inauguration parade in Washington, D.C., along with 5 other Native American leaders. And lest you think the elderly Indian has become a puppet of propaganda for the American press, Geronimo never gives up the fight for freedom for his people. 5 days after the inauguration ceremonies, Geronimo meets with President Roosevelt at the White House and takes the opportunity to request that his people are returned to their native lands in the West.
I pray you to cut the ropes and make me free.
But Roosevelt denies the request out of fear that war could once again break out if the Apaches return home. Now, in his 70s, Geronimo begins talks with a man at Fort Sill who was interested in documenting Geronimo's story. The man, Stephen Melville Barnett, is a superintendent of schools in Lawton, Oklahoma, and he has a simple but unusual request. He wants to hear Geronimo tell his own story in his own way.
If the Indians' cause has been properly presented, the captive's defense clearly stated, and the general store of information regarding vanishing types increased, I shall be satisfied.
Geronimo agreed to tell his story only if he had permission to do so from the military. Fearing an uprising, the military naturally declined to allow Geronimo's life story to be documented. The words of such a polarizing figure and fugitive of justice might be dangerous. But Barnett, undaunted, wrote to Theodore Roosevelt, explaining the situation and asking permission. The president agreed the book could be dangerous, but granted permission. True to Geronimo's own words, Barnett was careful to live up to his promise. Geronimo was equally committed, though he did not seem to care for the process of bookmaking. Barnett relays a story where Geronimo's sense of duty and honor is well displayed. He states that Geronimo was extremely ill, but had promised to meet the author and his translator to work on the book at the author's office, miles from Geronimo's home. A severe winter storm persisted that day, and the translator finally said that he didn't think Geronimo was going to show. Just then, out of the storm, rode a shadowy figure, hunched over his horse to brace against the cold. It was Geronimo, honoring his commitment against all odds. Geronimo's book was first published in 1906 and has since enjoyed a number of reincarnations. The man himself was not so lucky. He remained a prisoner of war for the rest of his life. In February of 1909, he was thrown from his horse, and he lay in the cold, exposed to the elements all through that night. He was found by a friend the next day, extremely ill, and he died from pneumonia on February 17th. At the time of his death, he was still on the federal payroll as an Army scout. Geronimo had passed on, but his influence continues to inspire. The federal government, however, wouldn't free Geronimo's people until 1913, 4 years after Geronimo's death. While researching this story, I learned why we yell Geronimo when jumping off something or out of something, like an airplane. Though several credible versions exist, my favorite story dates back to Fort Benning in the 1940s, when parachutes had just been adopted by the military. Private Aubrey Eberhart was among the first to test the parachute. The day before their first big jump, the men were treated to a movie that just happened to be one titled Geronimo, and made in 1939, starring Chief Thundercloud as Geronimo. On the way back to the barracks, Eberhart's comrades taunted him.
Come on, Eberhart, admit it. You're scared.
Yeah, I bet he stands there in the doorway after they call him, because he's too damn scared to remember his own name.
All right, damn it. I'll tell you jokers what I'm going to do. To prove to you that I'm not scared out of my wits when I jump, I'm going to yell Geronimo loud as hell when I go out that door tomorrow.
Eberhart kept his promise, and the cry was gradually adopted by the other members of his platoon. Although at first the military was against this, the practice became so commonplace that the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment adopted the practice officially in 1941, and even sought permission from Geronimo's family to use the name on their insignia. This wasn't the only inspiration derived from Native American culture. World War II paratroopers also adopted mohawk haircuts as a way of demonstrating their special brand of bravery. But bravery among America's fighting men wasn't the only thing Geronimo inspired. In June of 1905, he had been photographed sitting behind the wheel of a car, surrounded by other Native Americans. This picture was one of many taken that day, which was a special event held for members of the press. According to a letter written by Ivan Fauser of Caney, Kansas, There were several photos of Geronimo taken that day, including one depicting Geronimo standing beside a dead buffalo. The photo suggests the animal was freshly killed and even has several arrows protruding from the corpse. Falzer states the Miller brothers, the people who put on the event, advertised the photo as Geronimo's last buffalo. But in fact, it would have been his first, since buffalo did not live in the part of the Southwest where Geronimo came from. In the photo of Geronimo seated in the driver's seat of a car, next to him is Edward LeClaire Sr., a Ponca Indian wearing an elaborate beaded vest. Geronimo was impressed by the vest, and later that day, it was presented to him as a gift. When Geronimo died, he was buried in this vest. But years later, the photograph serves as inspiration to songwriter Michael Martin Murphey. It becomes the title track of his 1972 debut album, Geronimo's Cadillac, although the vehicle is actually a locomobile, not a Cadillac. The song becomes an unofficial anthem of the American Indian movement of the 1970s, and Murphy himself becomes an advocate for Indian rights. Murphy was later adopted by the Dull Knife family of Lakota. According to his nephew, while Geronimo lay on his deathbed in 1909, he said his final words,
"I should have never surrendered. I should have fought until I was the last man alive."
Many resources were used in researching this story. Although every effort has been made to present fact, some discrepancies may arise. I'd like to acknowledge the following resources: Geronimo's Story of His Life by Stephen M. Barnett, History.com, Indians.org, Wikipedia.org. Thanks for listening to our podcast. If you like what we're doing here, be sure to subscribe to our show on iTunes or Stitcher. Like us on Facebook at facebook.com/driftanramble and follow us on Twitter @driftanramble. You'll find show notes, links to resources, and details about the cast and crew for this episode on patreon.com at patreon.com/driftanramble. And if you choose to support our show, you'll find we offer many great rewards. A big thank you to Juan Perez, who played Geronimo, and to Pete Lutz of Pulppourri Theater. And thanks to Austin Beach, Scott Phillips, Jeremy Hennessy, and Mike Jansen of Audioblivious Productions. Our little show wouldn't be possible without the help of these dedicated voice actors. And speaking of incredible voice actors, I want to tell you about an amazing show that features incredible voice talent, outstanding production, and some of the most imaginative comedy, horror, sci-fi, mystery writing you can find on the web. The show is called Theater of Tomorrow and spans the spectrum of quality entertainment in ways you simply have to hear to understand. A sentient ship is stolen in the night. A private eye chases corruption on the moon. An interview with a man from the afterlife. Anything you can imagine is on stage at the Theater of Tomorrow. Science, horror, and mystery for your ears. Full seasons and standalone episodes with many more coming every month. Follow the Theater of Tomorrow on facebook.com/Theater of Tomorrow and on Twitter @Tomorrow Theater. Theater of Tomorrow is part of the Fate Crafters Network, where you can find a myriad of shows featuring a multitude of talented writers, producers, voice actors, and composers. Check out the complete line of shows at fatecrafters.net. And check back often, because there's always something new. fatecrafters.net. Our next episode is all about one of the last shady ladies of the Old West. This independent woman set off on adventure from the moment her feet touched the ground. At age 16, she eloped, and she soon found herself at the 1893 Chicago World's Fair. where she also sees Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. And it isn't long before she robs a stagecoach and begins her life of crime. It's the story of outlaw Pearl Hart on the next Drift and Ramble podcast. Until we meet again, I'm Steve Blizzen. See you on the next installment of the Drift and Ramble podcast.
The Drift and Ramble podcast is a Clear Voice Media production, hosted and produced by Steve Blizzen, with segment research and voice acting by Cheryl Blizzen. Additional contributions and content have been made possible by support from individuals dedicated to the art and science of storytelling and exploring the still fertile promise of the American West.